Andrew is a writer and an editor with the Pacific News Service, a short story writer, and for 8 years, a commentator on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. He co-founded New America Media, an association of over 2,000 ethnic media organizations in America. His essays have appeared in dozens of newspapers across the country, including the New York Times and Huffington Post. He has also published 2 books with reflections on the Vietnamese diaspora. Andrew will be sharing from various perspectives of the Vietnamese experience, including as the son of a former well-known South Vietnamese general, refugee, and immigrant rebuilding in America, and the returning to Vietnam today, both from a personal and journalist perspective. So please help me welcome Andrew Lam.
Thank you so much. I rarely get to hear the voices of Vietnam vets, and I have to say I learned quite a bit today. My writing has always been addressing the issues of immigration and Vietnamese American experience, especially in the West Coast, so for me it's also an eye-opening. I feel though that today I'm invited to, in a way, add complexity to the narrative of Vietnam. And so I'll just, and I prepare a speech or a piece of writing for it. Usually I speak from my mind, but I have a lot to say today, so bear with me as I read. I struggle to figure out what exactly to say today about Vietnam and the experiences that we all carry. Like those either experienced it firsthand or those who experienced it as a kind of inheritance, like children of refugees, of veterans, and so on. My relationship with Vietnam remains complicated, full of sadness, and it is one with so many contradictions and without any final resolution. My Vietnam experience keeps on changing with the time. I left Vietnam at 11 at the end of the Vietnam War. We lost everything when we came to America as refugees. There was a period in which we lived as impoverished exiles in refugee camps, then sharing an apartment at the end of Mission Street in San Francisco with 2 other Vietnamese families. We struggled for some time to make it to the middle class. Vietnam was never an easy to quantify topic and a hard to frame story. The issue of Vietnam keeps changing, but as a writer and as someone who came from that country, I wonder if in writing that involves Vietnam, we really are talking about the same country at all. Take a few headlines in the news recently. On CNN, Afghanistan haunted by ghosts of Vietnam. London Telegraph, Barack Obama must stop dithering or Afghanistan will be his Vietnam. New York Times, the Vietnam War Guide to Afghanistan. Baltimore Sun, Afghanistan is Obama's Vietnam. Global Post, which is America's longest war, Afghanistan or Vietnam? And the Canada Free Press, Vietnam and why we lost Afghanistan. Oftentimes when we mention the word Vietnam in the US, we don't mean Vietnam as a country. Vietnam is not Thailand or Malaysia. Its relation to the United States is special. It has become a vault filled with tragic metaphors. It stands for American loss of innocence, of tragedy, a legacy of defeat and failure. For the first time in our history, Americans were caught in the past, haunted by unanswerable questions, confronted with a tragic ending. So much so that my uncle, who fought in that war as a pilot for the Army, once observed that when Americans talk about Vietnam, they really are talking about America. Americans don't take defeat and bad memories very well, he said. They try to escape them, he said, in his funny but bitter way of talking. They make a habit of blaming small countries for things that happen to the United States. AIDS from Haiti, flu from Hong Kong, drugs from Colombia, and hurricanes from the Caribbean. Then there's my father, who only talks about the Vietnam War time. When he gets drunk, his memories go back to the time when he was a big shot, a warrior, when he fought battles and won. But he couldn't talk about the aftermath, about losing and at the end and how the ensuing humiliation and the horrible losses. of his comrades and his own brothers sent to the re-education camps. He can only go further backward to a time when the war was not lost. He holds so much anger still on what happened. He, like so many of his generation, hasn't been able to go past vehemence, hasn't been able to make peace with that past. I've been back to Vietnam many times, and each time I have been trying to put Vietnam into some proper perspective. Here's a passage from my book, Perfume Dreams, in which I went back and had an interesting conversation with the Vietnamese communist. Flipping through my United States passport as if it were a comic book, the custom man at the Noi Bai airport near Hanoi appeared curious. "Brother, when did you leave Vietnam?" "2 days before National Defeat Day," I said without thinking. It was an exile's expression, not his. "Oh my gosh, when did that happen?" he asked in a comic and exaggerated voice. "April 30th, 1975, I offered." "But brother," he smiled, "don't you mean National Liberation Day?" If this conversation had occurred a decade earlier, the difference would have created a dangerous gap between the Vietnamese and the returning Vietnamese American. But this happened a couple of decades after the war had ended, when the walls were down and the borders porous. And as I studied the smiling young official, it occurred to me that there was something about this moment, an epiphany. "Yes, I suppose I do mean Liberation Day," I offered. But not everyone remembers the date with a smile. It marked the Vietnamese diaspora, both people, refugees. On April 28, 1975, my family and I escaped from Saigon in a crowded C-130 cargo plane a few hours before the airport was bombed. We arrived in Guam the next day in time to hear the BBC's tragic account of Saigon's demise. U.S. helicopters flying over the chaotic city, Viet Cong tanks rolling in, Vietnamese climbing over the gate into the U.S. embassy, boats fleeing down the Saigon River toward the South China Sea. In time, April 30th became the birth date of an exile's culture built on defeatism and a sense of tragic ending. For a while, many Vietnamese in America talked of revenge, of blood debts, of the exile's anguish. Their songs had nostalgic titles like "The Day When I Return" and "Oh Mother Vietnam, We Are Still Here." April 30th, 1976, a child of 12 with nationalistic fervor, I stood in front of San Francisco City Hall with other refugees. I waved the gold flag with 3 horizontal red stripes. I shouted to no one in particular, "Give us back South Vietnam." April 30th, 1979, an uncle told me there was an American plan to retake our homeland by force. You know, the way Douglas MacArthur did for the South Korean in the 50s. My 18-year-old brother declared that he would join the anti-communist guerrillas movement in Vietnam, and my father sighed. April 30th, 1983, I stayed awake all night with Vietnamese classmates from Berkeley to listen to monotonous speeches by angry old men. National defeat must be avenged by sweat and blood, one vowed. But through the years, April 30th has come to symbolize something entirely different to me. Although I sometimes mourn the loss of home and land, it's the American landscape and what it offers that solidify my hyphenated identity. This date of tragic ending, from an optimist's point of view, is also an American rebirth, something close to the 4th of July. I remember whispering to a young countryman during one of those monotonous April 30th rallies in the mid-1980s, well, even as the old man speaks of patriotic repatriation, we've already become Americans. The assimilation processes, education, the English language, the American eye, these have carried me and many others farther from that beloved tropical country than the C-130 ever could. Each optimistic step the young Vietnamese takes toward America is tempered with a little betrayal of little Saigon's parochialism, its sentimentalities, and the old man's outdated passion. When did this happen? Who knows? One night, America quietly seeps in and takes hold of one's mind and body, and the Vietnamese soul sorrow slowly fades away. In the morning, the Vietnamese American speaks of a new language of materialism. His vocabulary is peppered with phrases like Mercedes-Benz, and two-car garage, and double income. My brother never made it to the Cambodian jungle. The would-be guerrilla fighter became a civil engineer. My talk of endless possibilities is punctuated with favorite verbs: transcend, redefine, become. I want to become a writer, I declared to my parents one morning, and my mother gasped. So, April 30th, 1975, defeat or liberation? Well, it was a day of joyous victory, say a retired communist official in Hanoi. We fought and realized Uncle Ho's dream of national independence. But then he asked for Marlboro cigarettes and a few precious dollars. Nguyen Nguyen, a real estate salesman in San Jose and a former Arvin naval officer, said, I could never forget the day so many people died, so much blood. I could never tolerate communism, you know. Mai Hung, a young, smartly dressed Vietnamese businesswoman in Saigon, had another opinion. Of course it was National Liberation Day, she said, but it's the South, she told me with a wink, that liberated the North. Indeed, conservative Uncle Ho has slowly admitted defeat to entrepreneurial and cosmopolitan Miss Saigon. She has taken her meaning from a different uncle, you know, Uncle Sam. The custom man, on the other hand, stamped my passport and whispered, in truth, brother, there are no winners, no losers. You're just lucky you left Vietnam and became an American. But that piece was written 15 years ago, and I've been back several times since then. And as I moved out of my father's shadows, I find that there's always new ways of looking at that country. A few years ago, for instance, I went back to Vietnam to make a documentary for PBS called My Journey Home, and I did the touristy thing. I went to the Cu Chi Tunnel near Tay Ninh province, bordering Cambodia. It's a complex underground labyrinth in which the Viet Cong hid during the war many years ago. There were several American vets in the 60s with me, and they fought in Vietnam and lost friends, and they were back for the first time. They were very emotional. A couple of them cried after they emerged from the visit. They went to look for the meaning of the past, and I went with them. Yet the young Vietnamese tour guide, born after the war ended, did not see that past. She has a dream of a cosmopolitan future. She spoke fluent English, made lots of friends overseas due to her job, and dreams of Disneyland. She crawled through the same tunnel with foreigners practically every day, but she emerged with a different idea. Her head is filled with the Golden Gate Bridge, and cable cars, and two-tier freeways, and Hollywood, and Universal Studio. So there I was standing at the mouth of the tunnel and thinking, in the end, there may never be a final conclusion about that war. There can never be one story about that war. There's the Northern Vietnamese version of that war where they liberated the South and saved those in the South from the American imperialists. And there's the story of the Vietnamese fleeing as boat people and re-education camps and young men fleeing from a war in Cambodia in which the Vietnamese were the imperialists. There were the American veterans coming back to look at their losses and make peace with the past. And here was a young woman who looked at the tunnel that was the headquarters of the Viet Cong, and what did she see? The Magic Kingdom. The Cu Chi Tunnel leads some to the past, surely, but for the young tour guide, it may very well lead to the future. I have many friends over there now, she said, reflecting the collective desire of young Vietnamese. They invite me to come. I'm saving money for this amazing trip to America. So the Vietnam War was a war with so many sides, and it's complicated by so many point of views and so many sided versions of the same thing. In that sense, when we talk about Vietnam, we should not simplify but expand, so much so that it will become the story of people, of human beings, rather than some purported metaphor for tragedy. My own story is that through the years, I made my own peace with it. James Baldwin once asked in a piercing essay, which of us has overcome his past? And probably answered in another, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. But with due respect, one can chase Baldwin's grim discernment with M. Scott Momaday's astute counsel. Anything is bearable as long as you can make a story out of it. The more mature response to one's tragedy is not hatred nor resentment, but the spiritual resilience with which one can, again and again, struggle to transcend one's own biographical limitations. History is trapped in me, indeed, but history is also mine to work out, to disseminate, to discern and appropriate, and to finally transform into aesthetic self-expression. And it is in stories about Vietnam, in looking at its current needs and its current problems, and trying to offer insights that I find my way home. And I'm not alone. A young Vietnamese American friend of mine from LA, whose sister was killed by Thai pirates while escaping Vietnam, recently returned to Saigon, where she is now a thriving entrepreneur. Another, the son of a colonel who spent 14 years in the re-education camp, spent his honeymoon in Vietnam despite his dislike of the Hanoi regime. Yet another friend whose father was the governor of Hue and who was in solitary confinement under communism for 10 years, while he went back, wrote a book and now owns a bar in Hanoi. My cousin, whose family was robbed of everything, has returned from France, married a woman, raised a family, and works for the French embassy in Hanoi. He's prospering where his father has once suffered in a malaria-infested re-education camp. This, he told me, is my best revenge. Another friend went a step further. She was forced to escape as a boat person with her family in the late 70s, has returned with money raised in Silicon Valley to help create a program to help impoverished families in the Mekong Delta from selling their children to traffickers. She's changing the destinies of many others like her for the better. Having lost the war, these people have emerged as victors of the peace. They've managed to remake themselves and go on with their lives. And more important, by refusing to let rage and the need for vengeance dominate their hearts, some have become active agents in changing Vietnam itself. So in the end, defeat or victory, national loss or liberation, metaphors of tragedy or a nation under enormous transitions, none of that really matters. Only lives lived every day matter. Only trying to influence the future for the better matters. Only by addressing the present day needs and suffering that the ghosts of the past can be appeased. And only when one looks at Vietnam not through the view that's rooted in historical vehemence, but through the view of human kindness, does the country open itself up. Who was it that say there's no east or west when you look up to the sky? There is no east or west either when you look at each other with an open mind and an open heart. That is, if we want to see Vietnam, or for that matter, any country beyond its geopolitics, its historical relationship with the US, then we need to open our heart. If we want to see human liberty, then we best try to uphold human dignity. And if we want to find peace, we must find a way to forgive others, and just as important, ourselves. But there's a way out of the jungle, out of the darkness, and it is to tell story, and it is in the willingness to hear other stories, and it is in our capacity for compassion. A while back, I heard the Dalai Lama say this to the American audience. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. It is easier said than done, I know. Rage and sadness sometimes flare up in me, and it feels as if nothing in the world could ever douse it. But if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. I believe in these words, and it's certainly what I strive for, despite the sadness and pains, and in the face of human suffering. I hope that's what we all strive for. Thank you.
One other thing about the war that people don't see is my first day in country when I was in Cameron Bay, before I got my orders where to go, I was put on KP duty. And part of the duty was to bring the food out to the dump and put it in the dump. And when you see these little kids, Vietnamese kids, have a handful of food, it's half maggots and half food, and they're eating it, that always sticks in my mind. It's the other side of the war that people don't see.
Yeah, I mean, the poverty of that country continues to be the case these days, even though Vietnamese is growing in GNP. But there is a rural-urban gap that is widening as the cities become more wealthy and the rural become sort of still entrenched in poverty. And you know, it's kind of a contradictory thing to find that Vietnam has been growing in GNP for the last 10 years, but it's also become the country that provides one of the most number of humans for trafficking. And part of that has to do with the gap between rural and urban, and how people in the rural become sort of victim to this like international commodity of humans. Our concept of freedom and what Vietnamese think of freedom is a little bit different, because in Vietnam, people are not taught to be political. I mean, they blocked it out very well, since politics is never part of the consciousness. I think it's kind of a conscious movement of the regime to do so. So no one owns a public space but the government itself, and so there is no kind of forum for you to share your ideas. Now it's being challenged by the internet, by dissidents who can blog and stuff, but for a long time, you don't own newspapers, you don't own radio station, you don't own TV, so that belongs to the government, so there's no forum to discuss your future, really. But what has happened over the years is that it went from a real police state where, remember before the Cold War ended, folks, you know, in Russia and China and Vietnam, they had to have ration card to buy rice, stand in line to get cabbage, you know, that was Russia's story. But after the Cold War ended, they liberated the economic system so that you can practice private capitalism. They, in fact, rewrote that into the Constitution. And so there was a lot of economic freedom along with movement of people. You know, you can go from one city to the next without having to fill out forms. And now they can actually fly out of Vietnam to go shopping in Bangkok, right? So that kind of freedom exists, but not political freedom. So you have economic and cultural freedom now, but not political freedom. And for Vietnamese, a lot of them feel that it is okay. You know, but I think it's sort of like that kind of three-pronged process. If you don't address political freedom at some point, that's going to be forced onto you, because the moment the economic crisis starts to hit, you start having people wondering why the system exists, right? People are like, why are we doing this? Same thing in China, right? When the economy started to falter, the Chinese suddenly become politically conscious, you know? So I think when a crisis hit, then that's when the politics get changed. Yeah.
Well, didn't that all tie into the historical perspective of colonialism?
Yeah.
You had the French, so you fought to try to get that colonial
Yeah.
power out.
Sure.
And the Japanese came in, you fought the Japanese.
Yeah.
And so it just seemed to me that we were just another...
They were, yes. It's part of that rationale, for sure. The only problem with that is that when the Soviet Union, who was the big brother of Vietnam during the Cold War, was the first to go to the United States when they fell apart and ask for a kind of, I would call, social welfare check, and the United States helped out Russia by the time the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the Vietnamese in Vietnam were quite shocked because they were the ones that told the Vietnamese to stay communist. And when they fell apart, they didn't even warn them and say, you guys stay communist, we're going to go to the US first and ask for handouts. And then the Vietnamese were foundering until the Chinese took over. And so that it's an interesting moment in history where Vietnam, even though they always say that they need to fight against imperialism, had always been in bed with an imperialist. If it weren't the Chinese and it was the Russian, it's always the big brother that took over, because being a small country, there is no such thing as independence, and they know it now. I have my mom's older brother was a communist and still is in Hanoi, and his grandson now is a big banker in in Hanoi, and his grandson said to him, Granddad, you say you have to fight imperialists, but now everyone wants American to invest. So why did we have to fight them in the first place? What if we had just let them invest? Wouldn't we have avoided a war? And my uncle say, I don't have an answer for that. Yeah.
I got one question that still confuses me to this time. We consider this North and South Vietnam as the 38th parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Was it ever at one time when it was just Vietnam?
Oh yeah. The French left and the country split in half. But before that, it was one country, right? When the last emperor, Bao Dai, was the emperor of the entire country. The reason why it got split because, the French were defeated, and then Ho Chi Minh took over the north, and the south was another regime. So, but they didn't go into a civil war just yet. And there was a moment where Ngo Dinh Diem, who was assassinated in '63, had actually thought of talking with Ho Chi Minh about a national election, meaning that instead of going into civil war, they wanted to consider an election, and if the people voted for Ho Chi Minh, then it would be a communist society. If the people voted for Diem, then it would be a democratic society or semi-despotic society, either way really. But at least a war would have been avoided. But Diem was assassinated, and so that idea was thrown out. But plus the Americans didn't want an election most likely because Ho Chi Minh was much more popular than Diem, and so the people would have gone communist instead.
Join us for March Vietnam Veterans Day. It's to put a face to who all our veterans are, and everybody's connected, including the Hmong and the Vietnamese, and honestly, us Amerasian children of American soldiers and other children of Vietnam veterans like Tracy over here, we shared yesterday at our banquet. We all have this unique connection to Vietnam, and we all have different stories, but there's a lot more similarities and common ground and coming together and learning from one another. And that's what this is all about. Not remaining separate, but coming together and heal with each other as well. So again, thank you, Judy, #1 news anchor over here, for spending all day with us. And thank you, Andrew. I'm really proud and honored for our first one. It's the beginning of what's to come, but we had you to be the one to be here with us today.